In the mathematics of war, this should never have happened. Just before dawn on Luzon, a Japanese night infiltration force slipped inside an American perimeter. A machine gun position fell. 70 soldiers slept 50 yards away. According to doctrine, the outcome was already decided. Then the numbers broke. In the next 36 minutes, a single American infantryman fired fewer than 50 rounds. When daylight came, 40 enemy soldiers lay dead. 2 mortar teams were silent, and the perimeter still stood. No reinforcements arrived in time. No artillery answered the call. The system failed, and one man filled the gap. This is not a story about bravery in the abstract. It is a story about probability collapsing under pressure, about why a tactic designed to work almost every time failed once, and never the same way again. To understand how this happened, we have to rewind to the moment doctrine stopped working. If you value historical stories that focus on facts, analysis, and the realities of war, not myths, consider subscribing to Epoch Battlefield Bureau. We publish deeply researched World War II documentaries every week. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its most lethal phase. The large cinematic battles were mostly over. What remained was something far more dangerous, a war of exhaustion fought at night in jungle terrain where visibility collapsed and doctrine struggled to keep up. On Luzon, the Japanese army no longer believed in winning through conventional means. Daylight assaults had become mathematical failures. American firepower, especially semi-automatic rifles and interlocking machine gun defenses, made frontal attacks suicidal. The numbers were unforgiving. When massed infantry met prepared American positions in open terrain, the outcome was not bravery versus bravery. It was arithmetic. So Japanese commanders adapted. What replaced the bonsai charge was not desperation, but calculation. Small unit night infiltration became the dominant tactic. Instead of attacking where Americans were strongest, Japanese units aimed to dissolve the very idea of a defensive line. They moved silently, cut wire, slipped through vegetation, and waited for the narrow windows when American vigilance was weakest. Guard changes, exhaustion cycles, the moments just before dawn. By 1945, this was no longer experimental doctrine. It was practiced, refined, and lethal. On Luzon alone, night infiltration attacks had inflicted thousands of American casualties. They worked because they attacked systems, not soldiers. A perimeter only functions if every position holds. A single captured machine gun nest does not merely fall, it becomes a weapon aimed inward. Once turned, it collapses the entire geometry of defense. That is exactly what happened near Dingolan Bay. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment was ordered to hold a hastily constructed perimeter around a critical supply route. The location was a tactical necessity and a nightmare. Dense jungle reduced visibility to less than 10 yards after sunset. Sound carried poorly. Movement was deceptive. The perimeter relied on 2 heavy machine gun positions placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Each position covered the other. Lose one, and the defensive logic unraveled. The men knew this. They also knew how long they had been awake. By early May, the regiment had been in near continuous combat for 3 months. Sleep came in fragments. Guards stood 4-hour shifts, then collapsed wherever they could, boots still on, weapons within reach. Exhaustion was not a weakness. It was the baseline condition. Japanese intelligence understood this rhythm. The assault force assigned to Dingolan Bay spent days observing American habits. They tracked guard rotations. They mapped firing lanes. They identified the moment when vigilance dipped not because of incompetence, but because human endurance has limits. Just before dawn, they moved. The infiltration force did not rush. There was no shouting, no firing, no wasted motion. Nearly 100 Japanese soldiers entered the American perimeter undetected. Their first objective was not personnel, it was infrastructure. The machine gun nest anchoring the defensive line was seized in seconds. From a doctrinal standpoint, the engagement was already over. A captured machine gun inside the wire represents catastrophic failure. The weapon is already sighted for maximum effect. Its fields of fire are known. Its ammunition supply is ready. Turn it inward, and sleeping troops become targets without warning or cover. Historically, this is how entire companies were destroyed before they could even react. American doctrine acknowledged this vulnerability. It also acknowledged the solution. You do not counter an infiltration force alone. You consolidate. You withdraw to secondary positions. You call for artillery. You coordinate a counterattack with adjacent units. Doctrine is built around the assumption that survival depends on system response, not individual action. One soldier, isolated inside a breached perimeter, is not expected to restore the line. He is expected to delay, evade, or die. This was not cynicism, it was realism. Against an organized night assault, a lone infantryman is blind, outnumbered, and exposed. Sound replaces sight. Confusion multiplies. Even identifying targets becomes uncertain. The probability of survival collapses rapidly with each passing minute. By the time the Japanese seized the machine gun position at Dingalan Bay, the mathematics were brutal. Approximately 70 American soldiers were asleep within 50 yards. Nearly 100 attackers were already inside the perimeter. Mortar teams were moving into firing positions. The Japanese force was intact, coordinated, and executing a plan that had worked repeatedly across Luzon. There was no reason to expect this night to be different. Nothing in the situation favored resistance. The terrain favored infiltration. Darkness favored the attackers. Fatigue favored surprise. Doctrine favored collapse. Every variable pointed toward a predictable outcome. Which is why what followed mattered. Because the Japanese plan did not fail due to error, hesitation, or lack of preparation. It failed because a single variable entered the equation, one that doctrine did not account for. Not superior firepower, not reinforcements, not luck. A man who did not respond the way the system expected him to. At the moment the perimeter should have folded inward, the math stopped working. And to understand why, we have to examine the one assumption every doctrine shared that night. The belief that an isolated soldier could not become the system himself. Military doctrine is built on patterns. It assumes that under pressure, most people respond in predictable ways. Fear narrows vision. Confusion slows decision-making. Isolation reduces effectiveness. These assumptions are not moral judgments, they are statistical truths, validated by decades of combat data. Japanese night infiltration doctrine relied on those truths. Once inside an American perimeter, the attackers expected panic, fragmentation, and delayed response. They did not need to defeat every soldier. They only needed to disrupt the system long enough for it to collapse on its own. That expectation had been correct, again and again. What doctrine did not account for was a soldier who did not behave statistically. At Dingalan Bay, the Japanese plan intersected with a variable that could not be modeled on a staff map or predicted by reconnaissance. A single infantryman whose training did not come primarily from manuals, drills, or classrooms. Private John McKinney was not an anomaly on paper. He was not an officer. He was not assigned a command role. He had no special designation beyond rifleman. His service record showed competence, reliability, and nothing that suggested extraordinary initiative. In the structure of an infantry company, he was interchangeable, which is precisely why doctrine ignored him. McKinney's background offered no conventional indicators of future distinction. He had grown up in rural Georgia, far from formal education and structured instruction. His literacy was limited. His aptitude scores were unremarkable. In a system that categorized soldiers by test results and standardized evaluations, he did not stand out. But systems that measure performance under controlled conditions often miss abilities forged elsewhere. From childhood, McKinney had learned to move through terrain where sound mattered more than sight. He learned to wait without shifting position, to read movement from subtle disturbances, to calculate distance without instruments, to fire only when success was nearly certain. These skills were not framed as tactics, they were necessities. They were also invisible to doctrine. When the Japanese officer struck him with a saber in the moments after the infiltration began, McKinney was not acting as a trained infantryman following procedure. He was reacting as someone whose survival instincts had been shaped long before the army issued him a rifle. The immediate response was not retreat. It was not concealment. It was engagement. This alone violated expectation. An isolated soldier, wounded in darkness, facing an unknown number of attackers, is expected to disengage. Every manual emphasizes preservation of force. You do not advance toward a captured machine gun position. You do not attempt to restore a perimeter alone. You buy time. McKinney did not buy time. He took space. What made his response so disruptive was not bravery in the abstract, but timing. He acted during the narrow window before the captured machine gun could be fully turned and employed. That window is measured in seconds, not minutes. Doctrine assumes that by the time a lone soldier understands what has happened, it is already too late. McKinney closed that window. He charged the position while the Japanese soldiers were still reorienting the weapon. This forced a transition from coordinated infiltration to close quarters reaction. In that moment, the attackers lost their primary advantage, control of the engagement. Inside the machine gun emplacement, the fight was brief and violent. When it ended, the position was retaken. But this was not victory. It was disruption. What followed mattered far more. Doctrine would now expect the soldier to consolidate, to hold the position, to wait. That is how defensive logic works. Static control of key terrain. McKinney did the opposite. He abandoned the position almost immediately. From a doctrinal perspective, this made no sense. A recaptured strongpoint is valuable only if it remains occupied. Leaving it exposes it to recapture. But McKinney understood something doctrine did not emphasize. Once revealed, a fixed position becomes a target. Instead of defending terrain, he defended uncertainty. He began to move. This decision transformed the engagement. By constantly shifting position, McKinney prevented the Japanese force from determining his numbers, his location, or his intent. Shots came from darkness, then silence, then from a different direction. The attackers could not establish a pattern. They began to respond individually instead of collectively. Small groups bunched together for perceived safety. Others fired blindly into the jungle, wasting ammunition. Officers shouted orders that could not be executed because no one could identify where the threat was coming from. The infiltration force had been designed to overwhelm a static defense. It was not designed to fight a moving, invisible opponent. McKinney limited his fire deliberately. He never remained in one place long enough to be fixed. He used natural cover instead of constructed positions. He advanced, paused, listened, and advanced again. This rhythm did not resemble infantry maneuver. It resembled hunting. The distinction mattered. As casualties mounted, the psychological balance shifted. The Japanese soldiers were no longer inside a sleeping perimeter. They were being hunted within it. Their initial advantage, surprise, had evaporated. In its place grew uncertainty. Even then, doctrine predicted McKinney's eventual failure. Ammunition is finite. Fatigue accumulates. Wounds worsen. A single rifleman, regardless of skill, cannot sustain combat against superior numbers indefinitely. This is another statistical truth. McKinney recognized the constraint and solved it in a way doctrine never anticipated. He moved forward into contested ground to resupply. This decision bordered on the suicidal. Advancing toward enemy positions contradicts every principle of individual survival. But by doing so selectively, only after firing, only under cover of confusion, he extended his combat effectiveness beyond its expected limits. Each resupply reinforced the illusion that the Americans had committed more men than they actually had. The phantom grew larger as the reality shrank. By the time Japanese mortar teams began firing into the perimeter, the engagement had already deviated far from plan. Coordination was gone. Units operated independently. Withdrawal attempts were cut short by precise fire. The infiltration force was no longer executing doctrine, it was reacting. This is the point at which military analysis later described the situation as tactically impossible. Not because McKinney was invulnerable, not because the enemy was incompetent, but because doctrine assumes that once systems fail, individuals follow. At Dingolan Bay, the reverse occurred. One individual imposed order on chaos. As dawn approached, the mathematics no longer described probability. They described aftermath. And when reinforcements finally arrived, officers would struggle to understand how an engagement that should have lasted minutes had instead rewritten an entire tactical assumption. Because doctrine had prepared for everything, except a man who refused to behave like a variable. By any accepted model of infantry combat, the engagement should have ended quickly. A single rifleman, wounded, operating in darkness against the numerically superior force inside a breached perimeter, has an extremely short survival curve. The variables stack against him relentlessly. Fatigue, ammunition depletion, sensory overload, and the inevitability of detection. That curve did not apply here. The reason lies in how McKinney treated time. He did not fight continuously. He fought in bursts. Every engagement was short, violent, and immediately followed by movement. This rhythm prevented the Japanese soldiers from synchronizing their actions. There was never a sustained firefight, never a fixed point of contact. Each burst reset the encounter, forcing the attackers to reassess from zero. In combat, reassessment costs seconds. Seconds accumulate, and in those seconds, initiative shifts. McKinney fired no more than 3 shots from a single position. That number was not arbitrary. More than 3 shots allow sound to triangulate. Less than 3 risk failing to neutralize a threat. 3 was enough to kill and vanish. Between bursts, he moved 5 to 10 yards, sometimes less, sometimes more. Always irregular, always unpredictable. To the Japanese soldiers, the engagement ceased to resemble a battle and began to resemble a series of isolated ambushes. They were no longer inside a perimeter. They were inside someone else's hunting ground. The jungle amplified this effect. Dense vegetation swallowed sound. Darkness erased depth perception. Shadows moved independently of bodies, Every rustle became a threat. Every pause carried uncertainty. Under these conditions, numerical superiority loses value. 100 men cannot bring 100 rifles to bear if they cannot see where to aim. As casualties mounted, Japanese units attempted to regain cohesion. Small groups formed, clustering for mutual support. From a human perspective, this was logical. From a tactical perspective, it was fatal. Clustered movement created predictable patterns. McKinney exploited them. His rifle mattered. The M1 Garand was not merely a weapon, it was a force multiplier. Semi-automatic fire allowed rapid follow-up shots without breaking sight alignment. In the time it took a Japanese soldier to fire, cycle the bolt, and reacquire a target, McKinney could fire multiple aimed rounds. At close to medium range, this difference was decisive. When groups clustered, he fired methodically. One target, then the next, then movement. He did not empty clips indiscriminately. He did not suppress. Every shot had intent. Ammunition discipline was central to his survival. McKinney entered the engagement with approximately 80 rounds, 10 clips. That number defines the engagement's upper limit. Without resupply, even perfect marksmanship would eventually fail. At his initial rate of fire, he would have exhausted his ammunition in under 15 minutes. This constraint forced a decision. Instead of conserving ammunition by disengaging, McKinney conserved ammunition by advancing. He moved into areas where Japanese soldiers had fallen, stripped ammunition from bodies, and withdrew before remaining units could react. Each resupply carried extreme risk. At times, he closed to within 20 yards of enemy groups. But each successful resupply extended the engagement beyond its expected lifespan. This is where the mathematics truly collapsed. Standard combat models assume ammunition expenditure increases over time. Here, expenditure was offset by acquisition. The engagement no longer trended toward depletion. It stabilized. The Japanese soldiers did not understand what was happening. From their perspective, American fire did not diminish. If anything, it appeared consistent. This reinforced the belief that they were facing a larger force than expected. The phantom grew. Psychological pressure compounded physical danger. Soldiers fired at movement that wasn't there. They shouted warnings that exposed their positions. Attempts to regroup triggered precise fire. Withdrawal became disorganized. Then the mortars began. 2 Japanese mortar teams established firing positions approximately 45 yards from the perimeter. Mortars change the character of an engagement instantly. They do not require line of sight. They punish movement. They kill without warning. For Company A, sleeping behind the perimeter, the mortars represented the most immediate threat. Each round that landed carried the potential for mass casualties. McKinney could not assault the mortar positions directly. The open ground offered no cover. The teams were protected by riflemen. A frontal attack would have been fatal. So he attacked the protection instead. He identified the supporting infantry and began to remove them one by one. Each shot was deliberate. Each target fell at ranges exceeding 70 yards, in near darkness, under fire. 11 shots. When the last protective rifleman fell, the mortar crews were exposed. They attempted to flee. McKinney killed them as they ran. The mortar fire stopped. At this point, the Japanese assault force was no longer a force. It was a collection of survivors attempting to escape a collapsing engagement. The remaining soldiers withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind the dead, the wounded, and a battlefield that no longer made sense. As dawn approached, McKinney's movement slowed. Not because of exhaustion, but because there was nothing left to engage. When reinforcements finally arrived, they expected chaos. They found order. The machine gun position was intact, the perimeter held. One man stood beside the weapon, blood dried across his scalp, rifle in hand. Around him, across nearly 70 yards of jungle terrain, lay the evidence of what should not have been possible. 40 enemy dead. Later analysis would reveal the full improbability. McKinney fired approximately 48 rounds. His hit rate exceeded 80%. He achieved this while wounded, moving constantly, engaging multiple targets at varying ranges in darkness. Modern combat statistics estimate tens of thousands of rounds fired per casualty. That night, the ratio collapsed to near unity. But numbers alone do not explain the outcome. What broke the mathematics was not accuracy, it was tempo. McKinney controlled the pace of the engagement from the moment he retook the machine gun position. He denied the enemy time to adapt. He denied them stability. He forced constant reaction. Doctrine assumes that tempo belongs to the attacker. That night, tempo belonged to one man. And by the time daylight exposed the battlefield, doctrine had no language left to describe what had happened. When the firing finally stopped, silence returned to the perimeter in fragments. It was not the calm that follows victory, but the kind that comes after confusion, when soldiers wait for the next sound, unsure whether the fight is truly over. At first light, officers from Company A moved cautiously toward the machine gun position. The volume of fire heard during the night suggested a company-level engagement. Reinforcements expected wounded men, destroyed emplacements, and scattered survivors. What they found did not fit any known pattern. The machine gun nest was intact. The weapon showed no signs of prolonged firing. Its ammunition supply remained largely untouched. Standing beside it was a single soldier, calm, upright, and visibly injured but functional. The surrounding terrain told a different story. Bodies lay scattered across nearly 70 yards of jungle, not clustered, not aligned along a defensive line. They appeared in irregular spacing, at varying distances and angles. This was not the footprint of a fixed position. It was the footprint of movement. Officers began counting. 10 bodies near the emplacement, more farther out, then more again deeper into the vegetation. As the search widened, the numbers climbed past what seemed plausible. 30, then 35, then 40. 40 enemy dead. No American casualties during the engagement. The immediate assumption was error. Perhaps the bodies belonged to multiple engagements. Perhaps other units had participated unknowingly. Perhaps the count was inflated by overlapping patrols. Battlefield confusion often produces false conclusions. So the officers verified. They examined cartridge casings. They checked wound patterns. They traced bullet impacts on trees and earth. They interviewed machine gunners wounded in the initial assault. They reconstructed movement based on body placement. Each step eliminated alternative explanations. The conclusion remained. One soldier had engaged and defeated a force nearly 10 times his size. This was not recorded casually. The company commander filed an after-action report using language rarely seen in formal documentation. The engagement, he wrote, defied conventional tactical analysis. The actions observed could not be explained by doctrine or standard infantry behavior. That phrase mattered. Tactically impossible is not an expression officers use lightly. It implies not bravery beyond expectation, but outcomes beyond modeling. It suggests that the assumptions underpinning training planning, and evaluation failed to predict reality. The report moved quickly up the chain of command. At each level, officers read it with skepticism. Then they read it again. Senior commanders ordered a full investigation, not to diminish the account, but to confirm it beyond doubt. Investigators returned to the site days later. They measured distances. They mapped firing positions. They calculated angles of engagement. They counted ammunition expenditure. The numbers were stark. Approximately 48 rounds fired. 40 confirmed enemy killed. An estimated hit rate exceeding 80%. Engagement ranges up to 75 yards. Conditions: darkness, jungle cover, ongoing movement, and a significant head wound. By comparison, modern infantry data suggests tens of thousands of rounds expended per enemy casualty across a campaign. Even allowing for exaggeration and error, the disparity was extreme. More importantly, the engagement showed no evidence of sustained suppression fire, no fixed defensive stance, and no coordinated support. Everything pointed to deliberate mobile action by a single individual. The investigation reached the same conclusion as the officers on the ground. This was not luck. It was control. Control of movement, control of tempo, control of engagement distance, control of psychological pressure. The Japanese force involved was not inexperienced. Intelligence later confirmed the attackers were drawn from veteran units trained specifically in night infiltration. Their failure could not be attributed to incompetence. That fact elevated the significance of the event. What occurred at Dingalan Bay was not simply a successful defense. It was a demonstration that under certain conditions, individual action could override systemic failure. The implications were uncomfortable. Doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It allows planners to predict outcomes within acceptable margins. But this engagement suggested that doctrine, when rigidly applied, could overlook rare but decisive variables. The findings did not lead to immediate changes in training manuals. Institutions move slowly. But the language used in the investigation, movement discipline, firing restraint, positional uncertainty, would surface again in later analyses of close-quarters combat. The soldier at the center of the investigation did not participate in these discussions. He answered questions when asked. He described what he did in plain terms. He did not frame his actions as exceptional. He did not articulate theory. To the investigators, this absence of self-analysis was itself revealing. The system had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because it assumed uniform behavior. At Dingalan Bay, uniformity did not exist. As the reports reached senior command, the final question was no longer whether the account was accurate. It was how to classify it. What category does an action fall into when it does not fit doctrine, statistics, or precedent? The answer came not in analytical language, but in protocol, a recommendation for the highest award for valor. Not because the act was dramatic, but because it exposed a blind spot in how war was understood. When the formalities ended, the war did not. For the institutions that studied Dingalan Bay, the engagement became a case file, a collection of reports, diagrams, and numbers. It entered archives, referenced occasionally by analysts interested in anomalies, those rare moments when outcomes escape prediction. For the man at the center of it, the story ended almost immediately. After receiving the Medal of Honor, John McKinney declined interviews. He refused speaking engagements. He turned down offers that would have transformed a single night into a lifelong identity. Within weeks, he returned to rural Georgia and resumed a life defined not by recognition, but by routine. This decision confused many observers. In American wartime mythology, heroes are expected to explain themselves, to inspire, to teach, to convert experience into narrative. McKinney did none of these things. When asked about the night on Luzon, his responses were brief and unadorned. He did not recount details. He did not frame his actions as extraordinary. "I did what needed doing." That sentence frustrated historians for decades, yet it reveals the final and perhaps most important dimension of his legacy. McKinney did not see himself as an exception. He did not believe he had disproven doctrine. He did not claim insight into the nature of war. He acted, survived, and returned home. The meaning others assigned to his actions did not interest him. But meaning accumulated anyway. In the years following the war, infantry training began to evolve, not because of Dingalan Bay alone, but because similar lessons emerged across conflicts. Static defense proved vulnerable. Movement became essential. Fire discipline replaced volume. Small unit initiative gained prominence. Many of these shifts echoed the patterns observed in McKinney's engagement. The principle of never firing repeatedly from the same position. The emphasis on breaking enemy perception rather than destroying enemy formations. The use of terrain and darkness as force multipliers rather than obstacles. None of these concepts were new in isolation. What Dingalan Bay demonstrated was their combined effect when executed without hesitation. For the soldiers of Company A, the legacy was more immediate. 70 men slept behind the perimeter that night. None were killed. None were wounded during the engagement. They returned home, built families, and lived lives shaped by choices that would not have existed had the machine gun fired inward. Years later, veterans sought McKinney out. They thanked him privately. They commemorated the night in modest ways: plaques, dedications, quiet ceremonies. McKinney accepted these gestures without comment. He stored them out of sight. He did not display the medal. This absence of self-mythologizing stands in contrast to how the story is often told. Dingalan Bay is sometimes framed as proof that extraordinary heroism requires extraordinary people. The evidence suggests something more unsettling. McKinney was not extraordinary because he was fearless, educated, or specially trained. He was extraordinary because he refused to surrender agency when systems failed. He did not wait for permission to act. He did not outsource decision-making to doctrine when doctrine no longer applied. This distinction matters. Wars are not decided solely by technology or planning. They are decided in moments when plans break and individuals choose how to respond. Most responses fall within predictable bounds. Occasionally, one does not. Those rare deviations are difficult to teach. They resist codification. They do not scale. But they leave traces. At Dingalan Bay, the trace was 40 bodies in the jungle and a perimeter that did not collapse. It was a reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems depend on human behavior, and that human behavior cannot always be standardized. McKinney lived the remainder of his life without seeking acknowledgement for this fact. He worked, hunted, and aged in obscurity. When he died, the world remembered him briefly, then moved on. The war, however, did not forget. The lesson remains embedded not in slogans, but in quiet adjustments to how soldiers are trained to think under pressure, to move, to choose, to act when the expected response no longer applies. In the mathematics of war, certainty is comforting. At Dingle Bay, certainty failed. And one man, who never asked to be remembered, showed what happens when someone refuses to let it decide the outcome. If this story gave you a new perspective on how wars are actually decided, hit like and subscribe to Epoch Battlefield Bureau. Your support helps us keep uncovering the real mechanics behind history's most decisive moments.